There was a time when Benjamín Arellano Felix lived amidst luxuries few Mexicans could ever imagine. Mansions in Tijuana with private security, armored luxury cars, discreet trips on rented planes, and a fortune estimated by the DEA to be in the billions of dollars. He was the financial mastermind of one of Latin America's most feared cartels, a man who controlled the flow of cocaine, methamphetamines, and marijuana into the United States from one of the continent's most strategic borders. His decisions moved entire structures and left profound consequences. Today, that same man awakens in a maximum security cell, without visitors, without privileges, and haunted by a date, 2033. The man who once commanded a vast criminal empire now faces a reality far more isolating and unexpected than any could have imagined. We will delve into his current life behind bars, exploring what is known and what almost no one has ever revealed. To understand Benjamín Arellano Felix, we must go back to Culiacán, Sinaloa, where he was born on March 12, 1952. He is the second of the Arellano Felix brothers, a family that began by trafficking contraband clothing and electronics before fully entering drug trafficking under the tutelage of Miguel Ángel Felix Gallardo, known as El Padrino. When Felix Gallardo was arrested in 1989 and the Guadalajara cartel fragmented, Benjamín and his brothers inherited the Tijuana Plaza, building upon it one of Mexico's most brutal criminal empires. For over a decade, Benjamín served as the cartel's financial and operational strategist, while his brother Ramón exerted terror on the streets. Benjamín was arrested in Puebla on March 9, 2002, by the Mexican army. 9 years later, he was extradited to the United States, and in April 2012, he pleaded guilty to racketeering and conspiracy to launder money before a federal court in San Diego, receiving a 25-year prison sentence without the possibility of parole. Yet, none of this fully explains what truly happened next. The Arellano Felix clan did not start in power. Their criminal history began modestly, almost anonymously, on the streets of Tijuana during the 1970s. In that border city, the brothers started operating on the fringes of petty smuggling, building contacts and learning the geography of organized crime from within. Their relationship with Felix Gallardo granted them access to a larger network and routes connecting northern Mexico with U.S. markets. Benjamín, the most calculating of the group, understood early on that money was as crucial as violence, perhaps even more so. While Ramón recruited hitmen, Benjamín constructed financial structures, established contacts in the business sector, and designed an architecture of corruption that infiltrated police, judges, and politicians on both sides of the border. At its peak during the 1990s, the Tijuana cartel was described by the DEA as one of Mexico's largest and most violent criminal organizations. It controlled the Baja California corridor from north to south, from Tijuana to Los Cabos, and moved tons of cocaine into California with industrial-like regularity. The city of Tijuana became a fortress under their dominion, and any external attempt to dispute that territory was paid for in blood. The brothers built a network of hitmen, trained, according to the Attorney General's office, with the support of Israeli instructors, and developed methods that would later be replicated by other criminal organizations. The cartel's fortune was measured in billions, invested in properties, legal businesses, and financial structures that gave an appearance of legitimacy to what was entirely illicit money. Benjamín was the architect of it all, the man behind the operation. The rivalry with the Sinaloa cartel marked the Arellano Felix clan in a way none of its members could have anticipated. The war with Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán was brutal, prolonged, and filled with episodes that transcended the criminal world to embed themselves in Mexico's collective memory. The most serious occurred on May 24, 1993, at Guadalajara International Airport, when cartel hitmen executed Cardinal Juan Jesus Posada Ocampo amid a shootout. The official version maintained for years that it was a case of mistaken identity, that the gunman confused the prelate with El Chapo. There was never a firm conviction or definitive judicial truth regarding this event. The assassination of a high dignitary of the Catholic Church in a Mexican airport ignited international pressure on the Mexican government to dismantle the major cartels. For Benjamín, that episode marked the beginning of the end of the impunity his organization had enjoyed for years. That day, Everything changed, though no one understood it at the time, because what happened that day didn't end there. It was the beginning of something that, over time, would eventually catch up to him. Benjamin's downfall began the day his brother Ramon died. On February 10, 2002, Ramon Arellano Felix was killed in Mazatlan during an operation that ended in a shootout with ministerial police agents. The news shook the cartel from within. Without its most feared armed wing, without the figure who maintained terror as a mechanism of control, the organization was left exposed at a critical moment. 26 days after Ramon's assassination, the Mexican army arrested Benjamin in the state of Puebla, where he had been hiding for months under a false identity, building a parallel life far from Tijuana. There was no shootout, no spectacular resistance. The man who had led a cartel for over a decade was apprehended almost discreetly in an operation that demonstrated authorities had located him long before acting. The image of the capo in custody circulated throughout the country and marked the beginning of the end. But what happened years later, far from power and inside a prison, would change the way he himself tried to tell his story. Following his capture in Mexico, Benjamín Arellano Félix was prosecuted in that country and sentenced to 22 years in prison for drug trafficking and organized crime. He served part of that sentence in high-security Mexican prisons, but the U.S. judicial system had its own accumulated charges. The DEA had tracked him for years, building a dossier that documented his involvement in cocaine trafficking to California, the laundering of millions of dollars, and his complicity in murders on both sides of the border. In April 2011, the Mexican government formally extradited him to the United States to face these charges in the Southern District of California court. At that time, Benjamin was 58 years old. He had been imprisoned for nearly a decade, and his cartel was merely a fragmented shadow of its former self. The following year, in April 2012, he pleaded guilty to racketeering and conspiracy to launder money as part of an agreement with prosecutors, and the judge sentenced him to an additional 25 years without parole. What follows is what no report has clearly told. There is something about Benjamín Arellano Félix's current life within the federal penitentiary in Virginia that is more revealing than any detail about his criminal past. Because the most impactful aspect is not what he did, but how he lives today. With Benjamin in prison and Ramon dead, the Tijuana cartel entered a spiral of decline that no restructuring managed to halt. Internal fragmentation, combined with the growing pressure from the Sinaloa cartel on Baja California territories, reduced the once powerful cartel to scattered groups lacking the cohesion Benjamin had built for years. The cartel that once was one of the continent's most feared became a minor structure, and while everything crumbled, he could no longer do anything. The U.S. Penitentiary in Lee County, Virginia, is where Benjamín Arellano Félix is currently serving his sentence. Far from major cities and media attention, this maximum security prison houses some of the most closely watched inmates in the U.S. system. There, the man who once moved millions of dollars and controlled international drug routes is now just another number within a system that does not distinguish names. USP Lee operates under a strict regime that makes no exceptions for any inmate, regardless of who they were on the outside. Life within USP Lee is governed by a strict system that eliminates any trace of autonomy. Each day begins at the same hour, follows the same rules, and ends under the same conditions. There is no room for improvisation or privileges for those who once held power. In this environment, time ceases to advance as before and becomes a constant repetition. Here, there are no decisions, only routine. One of the most significant facts about the current conditions at USP Lee is that visits are suspended. This measure, which applies to all inmates in the prison without distinction, means that Benjamín Arellano Félix cannot receive family members or lawyers in person until the situation changes. Available information at the close of this script indicates that this suspension remains in effect. For a man who built his power on networks of loyalty, contacts, and personal relationships, isolation from physical external contact is a form of symbolic amputation that goes beyond the penal. There are no meetings, no visits, no private face-to-face conversations. Contact with the outside world occurs only through supervised and restricted channels. No one enters, no one leaves, and no one sees him. But there is something even more unsettling. In 2022, Benjamín ARELLANO Félix wrote, in his own hand, a request for early release in which he said something no one expected to read coming from him. And what he wrote was not just a legal argument, it was a confession. In 2022, Benjamín ARELLANO Félix filed a request for early release under the compassionate release provision. In the document, drafted by himself, he argued that his conviction was for a nonviolent offense and that, with the passage of time, he had developed a different understanding of the value of life. He also appealed to recent reforms in the U.S. penitentiary system as a legal basis for a possible reduction of his sentence. But beyond the legal arguments, the writing hinted at an attempt to redefine his own history, a version the court would quickly question. In addition to the legal argument, Benjamín ARELLANO Félix claimed that his health condition placed him at risk within the penitentiary system, especially in the context of the pandemic. He asserted that his medical conditions, combined with his age, could aggravate any possible contagion and justified humanitarian intervention by the court. In that same document, he insisted that his history did not reflect violent conduct. For those familiar with the true scope of the organization he led for years, that assertion would not go unnoticed. In another segment of the request, Benjamín ARELLANO Félix spoke of his personal transformation. He described himself as a believer and practitioner of Christianity and claimed that within the prison, he dedicated himself to helping those in need as part of a genuine rehabilitation process. He asserted that he had undergone profound changes in his behavior and presented this process of change as an additional reason for the court to consider his early release. It is impossible to verify from the outside the real extent of that transformation. What is verifiable is that the federal judge reviewed these arguments thoroughly and found them insufficient against the weight of ARELLANO Félix's criminal record. The judge had stated in previous years that he would have sentenced the capo to life imprisonment if the plea agreement had not limited the maximum sentence to 25 years. That prior statement left little doubt about how he would rule on the early release petition. What the judge wrote about Benjamín ARELLANO Félix in his 14-page resolution is probably the harshest judicial description ever issued about this man. And there is one phrase in particular that no reporter has quoted with sufficient emphasis. The judge issued a 14-page resolution in January 2023, denying Benjamín ARELLANO Félix's request for early release. The decision was forceful in its language and precise in its arguments. The judge rejected the medical reasoning, noting that no active cases of the virus had been detected at USP Lee at that time and that all employees and inmates had been vaccinated. He also dismissed the age argument, indicating that the ailments that come with age would occur with or without imprisonment. But the most revealing part of the resolution was not the technical response to Arellano's arguments, it was the moral evaluation. The judge described Benjamin's leadership of the Tijuana cartel as ruthless and inhumane and noted that the acts committed under his command would, in his personal opinion, warrant a life sentence. Arellano Felix, the judge wrote, deserves the severe punishment the court imposed. Beyond the past, the judge also argued about the future. One of the reasonings included in his resolution was that despite the years spent in prison, there was a real possibility that Benjamín Arellano Félix could reconnect with the remaining associates of the organization he led for 2 decades if released. The judge even raised the scenario of a possible attempt to resurrect the Tijuana cartel from the outside. This projection was not an empty rhetorical exercise, it was a risk assessment based on the inmate's profile, the nature of the ties that criminal organizations maintain with their founders even decades after their fall, and the fact that the cartel, though weakened, continued to operate under different configurations. For the judge, requiring Arellano Félix to complete his original sentence promoted the objectives of deterrence and public protection. The answer was no. Without nuances, without exceptions. By then, prison was no longer a new environment for Benjamín Arellano Félix, but a completely accepted reality. Years within the system had reduced his world to controlled routines and limited spaces, very far from the mobility and reach that once defined his life. Isolation, more than a physical condition, had become a way of existence. And in that context, the man who operated for decades on an international scale now persisted in silence within a structure that does not recognize past trajectories. But that inmate number is not the only trace Benjamín Arellano Félix has left in the federal system. There is something more in his file, something many are unaware of, that speaks to what he can expect when, or if, he ever walks out of that prison door. What makes Benjamín Arellano Félix's case singular within the binational penitentiary system is that his sentence in the United States is not the only one he must serve. According to the terms of his extradition and the agreement reached in the Mexican judicial system, once his 25-year sentence in the United States concludes, Benjamín must be repatriated to Mexico to complete the 22 years of imprisonment to which he was sentenced in that country. If this occurs as legally designed, and if there are no modifications in either judicial system, Benjamín Arellano Félix could spend the rest of his life behind bars, shuttling between two countries. He is currently over 70 years old. The sum of both sentences, although with partial overlaps for years already served, projects him into a horizon of confinement that practically coincides with the end of his life. There is no public document suggesting that this equation will change in the short term. Regarding Benjamín Arellano Félix's current health status, public information is limited and must be handled with caution. What is verifiable in judicial documents is that in his 2022 early release request, Arellano himself mentioned having chronic medical conditions, without specifying them clearly in the publicly released fragments of the document. The judge acknowledged the existence of these ailments but considered them typical of age and not constituting an exceptional risk justifying release. Beyond that, there is no confirmed information about his specific medical condition, weight, mobility, or cognitive state. Making claims in that regard without documentary support would be speculation. What can be said based on verified data is that he is over 70 years old, has been incarcerated for over 20 years between Mexico and the United States, and that the passage of time in high-security environments leaves marks that no judicial file can fully quantify. Since late 2024, Benjamín Arellano Félix shares a prison at USP Lee with Genaro Garcia Luna, the former Secretary of Public Security under Felipe Calderón's government in Mexico, sentenced to over 38 years in prison for his ties to the Sinaloa cartel. The coincidence is historically significant: a man who was the security secretary of a government waging war against drug trafficking, and the leader of the cartel that same government fought, both confined in the same federal penitentiary in Virginia. There is no verified information on whether any interaction exists between them within the prison, and given the structure of a maximum security prison, any contact would be minimal and highly supervised. But the symbolic image is powerful. In the same building, under the same rules, subject to the same isolation regime, are two men whose lives were defined by the same system of corruption and violence that destroyed thousands. And yet, while all this unfolds within that prison in Virginia, outside in Mexico, the Arellano Félix surname lives on in ways Benjamín probably could not have anticipated from his cell. The Tijuana cartel, or what remains of it, has undergone a series of reconfigurations since Benjamín and his brothers began falling one by one. By 2026, according to information from the weekly Z Tijuana and specialized organized crime media, the residual organization headed by Enedina Arellano Félix would have established alliances with Los Chapitos, the sons of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, the very man with whom the Arellano Félixes waged a bloody war during the 1990s. The historical irony is brutal. The cartel that for years defined its identity by violent opposition to the Sinaloa cartel ends up seeking shelter with the heirs of its worst enemy. Benjamín Arellano Félix, the man who designed that cartel strategy, serves his sentence in Virginia, while the surname he built with decades of violence navigates alliances he never could have imagined. Benjamín Arellano Félix's daily routine within USP Lee follows, as far as can be verified, the institution's standard protocol. Waking at 6 a.m., punctual attendance at meals at established times, fulfilling the mandatory work assignment imposed on inmates, maintaining his cell in order, and respecting coexistence rules. Free hours allow access to televisions in common areas and the use of radios or audio players purchased within the penal system. There is no confirmed public information about specific additional activities in which Arellano Félix participates within the prison beyond what he himself mentioned in his release request, that he practices Christianity and helps other inmates. Whether these activities continue or have varied is something no verifiable source has been able to confirm after the 2023 judicial resolution. There is a dimension of prison that data and judicial records do not fully capture, and which is especially significant in Benjamín ARELLANO Félix's case, the accumulated weight of time, not as an abstract number of years, but as a lived experience in an unchanging environment where each day reproduces the previous one with almost mechanical fidelity. A man who made decisions that moved entire organizations, who ordered operations on a continental scale, who moved between cities and countries with the impunity afforded by money and fear, now lives in a space of a few square meters, where every movement is codified by regulations that admit no exceptions. It is impossible to know with certainty what happens within a mind under such conditions, but it can be verified that he has been in this state for over 2 decades, first in Mexican prisons and then in U.S. federal facilities, and that according to all available indications, this state will continue for at least another 7 years. But there is a question that has not yet been answered, and which is perhaps the most important of all. What happens in 2033 if Benjamín ARELLANO Félix completes his sentence in the United States and is indeed deported to Mexico? What would await an 80-year-old man returning to a country where his cartel no longer exists and where his name is part of a history that Mexican organized crime has already surpassed? The year 2033 appears in judicial documents as the official horizon of Benjamín ARELLANO Félix's sentence in the United States. If there are no upward modifications or additional sentence reductions, that is the year the U.S. federal penitentiary system will close his file. But that closure does not imply freedom. It implies, according to the terms established since his extradition, deportation to Mexico to complete the outstanding years of the sentence imposed in that country. By the time that moment arrives, ARELLANO Félix will have turned 81. No public information exists on which Mexican prison would receive him, under what conditions, or what legal mechanisms would apply at that time. What is observable is that the Mexico of 2033 will be a country whose organized crime map has changed in ways no current analysis can predict with certainty, and in which the ARELLANO Félix surname carries the weight of a history that the new generations of drug trafficking no longer need to build their own. The legacy of the Tijuana cartel under Benjamín ARELLANO Félix's command is a history of systematic destruction. According to figures documented by the DEA and Mexican authorities, the organization was responsible for over 1,000 murders of civilians and police during its period of greatest activity. It introduced tons of cocaine into the U.S. market for decades, corrupted institutions on both sides of the border, and perfected methods of body disposal that later spread to other criminal organizations. The assassination of Cardinal Posada Ocampo in 1993 remains one of the most serious unsolved crimes in Mexico's criminal history. None of that can be undone. No request for early release, no religious conversion, no legal argument can erase the years of an organization that left a trail of pain still active in the memories of hundreds of families. Benjamín ARELLANO Félix knows it. The judge who denied his release knows it, and the judicial record clearly states it in legal language. There is something profoundly difficult to process when looking at both images simultaneously: the Benjamín ARELLANO Félix of the 1990s, the man who controlled one of the most strategic borders of global drug trafficking, who made decisions in private and whose consequences were felt in entire cities, who accumulated a fortune that the international financial system helped move and hide, and the Benjamín ARELLANO Félix of today, inmate number 00678-748 in a federal prison in Virginia, who handwrites his own request for freedom, who cites the U.S. Congress's First Step Act, who describes himself as someone who now understands the value of life, who practices Christianity and helps his cellmates, and to whom a judge responds with 14 pages that conclude in a single word: no. The distance between these two images is the story of what time can do, what justice can achieve when it functions, and what happens when consequences finally arrive. And yet, as our story concludes, there is something this script cannot resolve: whether the cell in Virginia is the punishment or simply the epilogue. Because the most uncomfortable question is not who Benjamín ARELLANO Félix was, but what it means that such a man could operate for so long with such impunity and cause so much damage before the system finally caught up to him. Today, the only completely verifiable fact is this: Benjamín ARELLANO Felix remains incarcerated in a federal prison in Virginia, with a date marked on the calendar pointing to 2033. His attempt to be released earlier was rejected, and there is currently no indication that his situation will change in the short term. Beyond the files and numbers, what remains is the image of a man who went from controlling one of the most important drug trafficking routes to living under a system that no longer responds to his name, but to his sentence. Beyond his personal story, Benjamín ARELLANO Felix's case leaves an open question about the limits of justice and time. There are no simple answers, only a dossier that continues to grow while his name remains within it, because in the end, the only thing that neither power nor justice negotiates is time.